Yep.
So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our monthly GPN speaker series, where we aim to showcase innovation in the optimal youth development research space. And we also want to connect educators and youth stakeholders from all over the world. My name is Jackie Joyce. I am a research associate with the Global Possibility Network, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Andrew Babson, and he will introduce our speaker and tell us more about the Global Possibility Network.
Hey, good morning, everyone, again, and especially to those of us who have just joined us. So I'm Andrew Babson. I'm Associate Director of the GPN. We co-founded this initiative at Penn 4 years ago, and our goal is twofold, basically. We consult organizations on how to maybe improve or to add to what they're doing in their youth services capacity through research. And we also are a network. We're a community of like-minded scholars and people throughout the world. And a core concept for us is possibility development. And possibility development can basically be summed up as the cultivation and exploration and the pursuit of possibilities in one's life. And a key part of that are support structures. So support structures in our families and in our own networks, but also in society. You know, what kind of support structures are out there through institutions, government, et cetera. And then finally, a big focus for us is trying to reach, as Bill Wilson has famously said, the least advantaged, the truly disadvantaged in our society, and especially young people that are disadvantaged through no fault of their own, and so to reach those young people especially. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Ashley Cureton. She is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and she's going to be presenting her work today on refugee youth and out-of-school time. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Dr. Cureton. Welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I am going to share my screen. If you can give me a thumbs up, if you can see it, that'll be great. Love it. All right. So as stated, I am Ashley Cureton. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Go blue, go blue, go blue.
Go blue.
I know, right? Yeah, through and through. Yes. I also have an appointment in the School of Education as well. And I'm excited to be here today to share a little bit about a study that I worked on a few years ago, but I think is absolutely relevant to the really incredible work that's being done with the network. So the presentation is called Making a Change, Exploring Refugee Youth's Civic Engagement in Out-of-School Programs to Promote Critical Consciousness. It's a long title, but we'll dig in. So I'm going to give you some background. But before that, because I don't know most of you, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am. And so I do a lot of global and local work. It focuses on child, family, and community-based intervention, supports, and programs to address educational, environmental, and mental health needs among refugee and migrant youth and their families. And so I've been doing this work for about 15 years now. I have a background as a social worker, so I worked in schools in that capacity, working with migrant and refugee youth. I also was a caseworker. All of my work is based on working with schools and/or refugee-led organizations, community orgs, et cetera. So I'm always partnering with another entity to really think about solutions and initiatives to support refugee and migrant youth. So I was in Chicago for a while. In fact, that's where I received my PhD, my master's and PhD at the University of Chicago. And so I'm definitely embedded in a lot of the communities, working with refugees. I did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. And so I worked with refugees in the Baltimore and the DMV area. And then now here in Michigan, I work closely with several school districts with refugees and migrants. I also do a lot of global work, hence why you see this map. And so I've had the opportunity to work within school settings or school and/or community settings in South Africa, in Zambia. And next Friday, I'll be headed to Uganda. I'll be working with some community organizations and in one of the big refugee resettlement camps in Uganda. I've done some work in Morocco, as well as in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and I did some work in India as well, working with refugees from Sri Lanka. And so a lot of my work, there's a common thread. You'll see that shortly as I go over some of the background of my study. All of it is with youth. Everything I do is with children and youth, families more broadly, because sometimes I am interested in how the family unit can also support the overall development growth of young people. But that really is a central theme of mine. And so I kind of touched this already, but once again, very much so immersed in this work, and we'll continue to do that. I really do find a lot of joy working with young people and watching them grow and develop. And even though they've experienced some hardship, right? Like they have been displaced and having to start over, the level of resilience and excitement and joy and push, right? Like they're constantly thinking about, you know, the future and the hope that they want to gain. So very much so informs the work that I do. So I won't assume that everyone knows who a refugee is. I'm sure you've seen images in the news, and believe it or not everyone you see in the news is actually considered a refugee as defined by the United Nations. So just to give a little context, I won't go into a big lecture. I could do that, but I will not. A refugee is someone who is outside his, her, or their home country, who has a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. This definition was created back in 1951 through the Refugee Convention. Most countries are still using this pretty old, I would argue, definition to really define a refugee. Every country, every nation state can adapt it, but the US, we still draw on this quite a bit. And so there's usually some level of protection that is offered by the UN. They offer certain resources. And so there's so much that comes with that, but this typically what that is defined. And just to give you a general sense of the global refugee crisis, it's actually the worst that it's ever been in history. And that shouldn't surprise you based on even what we see in media. And so according to the UNHCR, there are more than 117 million people who are forcibly displaced or stateless worldwide. Of that, and once again, I'm just going to focus on refugees. There are other groups that we could also consider like internally displaced people. These are folks who there is some war, there's some strife that's happening in their country. Instead of leaving their country, perhaps they go to another region. That actually makes up most of the people who are displaced. And so we could spend time on that. We don't have time. So we're mostly going to focus on the 29.3 million refugees around the world. 41% of this large number, which is even hard to fathom, are children. So that's why I specialize in working with refugee youth and children, because they make up such a huge part of the people who are displaced. Just to give you a little bit more data, children are dramatically overrepresented among the world's refugees. So today, nearly 1 in 3 children living outside their countries are child refugees. And just so the other number, 1.9 million children were born as refugees. So you have droves of people who are born in refugee resettlement camps, or their families have locally integrated into neighboring countries. So let's say someone is fleeing the strife, the war in Syria. Many of them are not coming to the United States. They're not going to Europe. They're actually going to places like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. So they're going to neighboring countries. Jordan has a fairly large refugee camp there. What I'll be doing in Uganda, same thing, right? There's a lot of people who are fleeing from the Congo, or from Sudan, right? There's a lot of people who are fleeing to these other countries. And so there's people who their lives, they spend decades in these refugee camps. And so children are born into it. And so in the US, because once again, I do a lot of work globally. We're not going to focus on that today. We are going to focus on the young people who come to the US. Since the 1980s, the US has resettled more than 3.1 million refugees from some of the countries I've named: Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine. And about 35 to 40% of them are also children in the US. So still on par with even the global numbers. A large number of people are coming to the US, refugees who are coming to the US are children. And so some of these slides I'm going to go through quickly because I don't think I need to convince any of you the value of after-school programs, but that really is one feature of my study, is really thinking about how after-school programs or OST programs, how they are beneficial to young people. Research supports it. I'm not going to belabor the topic, but it is also very essential for refugee youth. Now, another study I worked on, it actually shows that even though research shows that it's very useful for refugees in terms of their overall development, they can learn social norms, learning English, etc. Refugee youth, for a variety of reasons, are not engaging in as many after-school programs as they could, or that is encouraged. And so that's another study. I'm not going to focus on that, but I did want to emphasize that research still across the board, even with refugee and migrant youth, it really is truly it's extremely beneficial for their development. I don't know why this slide's not coming up. What the slide will say or would say is giving you some background on civic engagement. And so just defining what it means to be civically engaged. So volunteering in your community, to engage in letter writing, voter registration, campaigning, right? There's a slew of activities that would constitute civic engagement. Not sure why it's blank, but we're going to continue on. And so the biggest thing, so I'm going through these quickly because I think I'm speaking to a crowd that probably gets after-school programs matter. Civic engagement, there's research that supports that it is an absolutely valuable tool that can help young people to develop a sense of self-worth, to feel a sense of connection with their communities, to place value on some of their interests, all of that. Now, this whole concept of critical consciousness originates from the writings and the popular education of Paulo Freire. And so he believed that a critical understanding of poverty, oppression, and exploitation was absolutely critical to young people having a more positive outlook on life, but also to create change. And so it really does help them to develop as young people, but also and to really develop a sense of self. Now, there's not a ton of research that focused on refugees and what is their role in being civically engaged in their communities, right? Like what voices or impact can they have in their communities to create change? And so that was the motivation for this study. Keep going. This just gives a little bit more, assuming that maybe some of you are not as familiar with this work, which if you aren't, you should be. So it also it considers how young people, or how people in general, can become more aware of social and economic inequalities and their causes, why are systems oppressive, and what can be done to transform these social and political conditions. And there's an element of reflection and action that's geared towards transformation. So it's one thing to observe that the world is inherently flawed, right? It's flawed, that there's oppression, that the young people, in fact, are the ones who are being oppressed. So that in and of itself is novel, right? If young people can identify that. But then there's this other layer of what you can do about it, right? And some of the young people being able to engage in political activism, that they feel like they have a level of agency to do that. And so just another layer, research shows that youth civic engagement functions as a path to critical consciousness. And so you can see I, once again, wrote another paper, read it at your leisure, and there's other research to support that as well. So I'm going to say CC moving forward because it shortens it a little bit, but it is a liberatory process. And so there are 3 dimensions that are a major feature of CNC. I've already mentioned the importance of critical reflection. There's motivation, which sometimes it's also known as agency or empowerment. And this is one's ability to enact change. So a young person's ability to feel like they can enact change. And then finally, critical action. So, how they can move forward and to create change and to really address the inequalities they are being confronted with. And this just gives you another diagram. I'm a visual learner, so just so you can see, they're all intertwined, right? And so it really is important for young people, if they really are going to dig deep into CNC, for them to really think about, once again, what is the motivation or the overall reflection, what is prompting them to want to engage in this type of work. We're going to talk about that in relation to this study, and that is one of the questions, like what motivated you to want to be civically engaged. And once again, this awareness, you're asking questions, you're probing, you're pushing back on the structures that are flawed and that are inherently oppressive. And then finally, the action piece. And so just to give you the two questions that grounded this work. One, what motivates refugee students to engage in out-of-school time? I don't know if I ever actually said that. So in some of the literature, it's actually the OST, so it's out-of-school time, and in other spaces, it's after-school programs. They're used interchangeably. Excuse me, but how did these programs promote civic activities? And secondly, how does involvement in civic duties activate refugee youth's critical consciousness, prompting them to become more involved in their schools and communities? And so I use phenomenology. If you're unfamiliar with this methodology, it essentially allows for the young people to explore their overall motivation and engagement in the out-of-school time. And so there's understanding the essence, or what is a common thread through among the stories or the narratives of the young people. And they all are typically experiencing a particular phenomenon. So in this instance, most of the young people, if not all, they've been forcibly displaced. They are refugees here in the US. They're having to not only navigate a new culture, a new language, communities, et cetera, but also they're being confronted with the inequality that's also present here in the US, right? So even if they weren't born here, perhaps someone from the Congo, for example, they identifies, or they may be perceived as Black, right? And so there's a lot of inequality that Black Americans or people from the many people who are born here, who identify as Black, or from the Black diaspora, who have to experience. And so many of the refugee youth, they also are confronted with that, and now they have to navigate these spaces that are oppressive. And so in terms of the sampling, and I'll go through some of this fairly quickly. I do like methods. Research is great. I love theory as well, but I'll move through this. This was a small sample for this study itself. So there were 15 refugee youth who were part of the study. 5 were from Syria, 4 were from Iraq, 3 were from South Sudan, and then 3 were from Burma and Myanmar. I think I mentioned to Andrew earlier that this study was actually a part of my larger study of my dissertation. So the entire sample was about 100 youth. It yielded like 6 papers. There was so much data to get through. Anyone who engages in qualitative data knows there's a lot, but it's rich. There's a lot of rich data. So this is just this was a study, a sub-study, I guess, or yeah, there was so much rich data on this topic that I wrote a separate paper. I collaborated with a community organization. I changed their name. Once again, all my work is community engaged. And so they were instrumental in helping me to recruit young people for this study and from an overall a dissertation study. The interview sessions lasted for about 45 to 60 minutes. Refugee students received a $10 gift card to Target. There were interpreters available if students needed them. Typically, I recruit young people who can speak some English, but once again, they're learning it. And so for some of them who wanted to delve deep and really process some of their motivations around being civically engaged, there were interpreters available for that. The interviews were recorded so that I could revisit some of those themes, and the data was collected from January through October 2018. There were follow-up interviews conducted with some of the young people in 2019 as well. I wanted to note that these interviews, they actually overlapped with the Trump administration. And so some of the young people, they actually noted that they were civically engaged to resist or to push back from some of the negative rhetoric or discourse around refugees and migrants during that term. Now, mind you, there's resistance and pushback that happens, unfortunately, through every term, but it was even more robust during the Trump administration. So I wanted to make that note to ground with some of the feedback. And in terms of the analysis, I used the phenomenological hermeneutic interpretive approach, which is long, so we're going to say IPA. And this allows more of a focus on making sense of the phenomenon, but using the young people in this example to really draw that out. So as the researcher, really honing in on certain phrases or words that really name the essence or the meaning behind why they were engaging in certain activities. This is a useful technique when you're engaging in one-on-one interviews, as it allows me, the researcher, to unpack the rich descriptions of the human experiences that are being conveyed. I used in vivo for this process, and so there were 3 steps to that. And so I read each transcript in its entirety. I typically wrote memos in order to capture my initial findings or perceptions, observations that the young people were sharing, to ensure that the findings are reliable. I also, I met with some of my mentors to talk through what some of those salient themes were, what were some ideas or overarching themes that were coming out of the information. And then from there, I wrote up the findings. Also to ensure trustworthiness. So I'll pause here because I think some people may be wondering, why do you have to do this? There's always this notion that in qualitative data, it's not as rigorous, or that it, how could you replicate that, right? Whereas in quantitative research, it's like, yeah, and believe me, coming from University of Chicago, I know how to do my stats because I had to, right? And I definitely draw on mixed methods quite a bit. But sometimes there's a question about, in quantitative research, there's all these checks. There's ways to ensure that your research is reliable. So these are, if you're not used to qualitative research, these are techniques to ensure that your research is also reliable, and that if someone wanted to pick it up and replicate it, they would also get the same type of findings. So bracketing, if you're unfamiliar with that, is another technique so that me as the researcher, I can reflect on the findings and then also think through, after I established my findings, I circled back to the young people, to the stakeholders, to actually present those findings. I wanted to see if how I am capturing or what I'm capturing in the interviews and or my analysis, if it aligns with what they were attempting to convey, if they had any suggestions on how to forge ahead, what should be considered, etc. So those were all a part of the process after I went through my findings. And also, finally, a huge tenet of qualitative research, which I would argue should be for all research, is really thinking about my overall positionality. So this is who I am. How do my intersectional identities inform the work that I do? How could I ensure that I don't rely on any biases and we all have biases that might impact how I'm interpreting what they're conveying. And so something that I always do in my work, I don't have the slide here, is I always kind of name in my papers and even with the people I work with, how I'm showing up as a Black woman, and as a first generation, where I'm from. I was born in Kentucky, right? So all these different factors, but also that I've worked with refugees for a very long time, but I'm not a refugee. I'm not an immigrant. And so I'm going to interpret things vastly different. And then, of course, all the work that I've done globally with this group. And so now the findings, the fun stuff, although the methodology is fun. So I think that's all fun, but the findings is what you want to hear. So one of the major themes that came up was a sense of duty. So refugee youth, they were involved in civic duties because they wanted to become more aware of their rights as refugees and to push back against the xenophobic and negative beliefs that refugee groups are a drain on the U.S. culture, that they are bad for our economy. And then there was this notion, and we could spend even more time unpacking this notion of being a good citizen. And this was particularly true for some of the refugee youth who identify as Muslim. They mentioned that there's negative views of them, and that they wanted to push back on this idea that they were a bad citizen. And so one of the students stated, before attending the know your rights workshops. And just as an aside, these workshops, they are quite common among refugee and immigrant groups. And they're usually conducted at local organizations, refugee-led orgs, et cetera, to inform refugees and migrants of what their rights are. Many of them don't know how to navigate certain spaces, or they feel a level of anxiety when they hear policies that are being rolled out that could possibly harm them, or that they might be deported. Now, refugees can't be deported because they are legally here and they've been identified by the UNHCR. But some of them may not know that, right? There's a lot of legal jargon and policies, and that creates a level of anxiety. And so some of these workshops, I've actually led some of these workshops. I've attended many. They really can assuage anxieties that some of the refugee and migrant groups may feel. So I wanted to give that as a caveat. So before attending the workshops, I didn't know I had rights. Like, I'm a kid, but I have rights and I have a voice. And my family has rights. They encouraged us to use our voice for change. They also encouraged us to vote and to tell our families to vote once they became citizens. And so as you can see, this young person, one, how powerful is it that he was able to learn that he had rights. Perhaps before attending this workshop, he didn't know that him and his family had rights, and to be able to convey that to his family. So he definitely felt a level of obligation to know this information. I think the student, if I recall, was 15, right? So a 15-year-old is taking on a lot to really know what his rights are, and then to convey that to family, which is powerful. So Haima, another young person, shared how she enjoyed campaigning in her community around the importance of voting. I know I can't vote right now, but I still like to campaign around this issue, voting rights. I like to describe the electoral process to my neighbors and to my family and family friends. I think it's important. So once again, another student recognizing voting is important. Perhaps they can't engage in that civic duty now, but they are excited about the possibility of sharing the importance of it to their friends and family. And then finally, Muhammad stated, I'm in America. I've got to do something. I can't just sit around and not do anything. People think we, refugees, are bad people, or that we're lazy or want too much, but we're not. It's up to me to speak up and show that we can do stuff for ourselves. That's why I attended the academy, the Youth Civic Leadership Academy. So sidebar, one of the after-school programs offered a comprehensive academy for the young people. It was maybe 5 weeks long. And so they learned different aspects around civic engagement and ways that they can be involved in their community and to build their leadership skills. This program in and of itself is quite novel. I wish it was available for all young people. I absolutely would have benefited from this as a young person. But from this program, he felt that he was emboldened to actually do more in his community, which was quite powerful. The second reason was to build a sense of community. And so several students expressed their motivation to engage in their communities as a mechanism for building connections with their peers and community members. So in addition to this idea of a sense of duty, it was a way to build community, which, once again, these are young people, they're resettling here in the US. Perhaps they are feeling isolated. They're meeting people within their schools, but depending on where you are, there isn't a welcoming space at your schools. Some of these after school programs within their communities can also be a way to kind of build community and relationships with their peers and adults. And so Yusra stated, I like passing out flyers with my friends. We get to walk around the community and knock on doors. Sometimes we break into small groups and compete to see who can knock on the most doors. It's fun. Like, I met them through this program and we're like friends now. That's cool. Oh yeah, I get to meet folks in the community. I didn't know so many people were here. And so Yusra was not the only young person who named the importance of building community and feeling like she had a connection with people who had similar identities as her. Haita, a Burmese refugee teen, also stated, I've attended several campaigns and community meetings to discuss the rights of refugees, like the idea that we can't be deported, or like how to help our parents get citizenship and stuff. I've learned a lot. So yeah, I get to see my friends too. I feel like we're a part of a larger goal. And so this young person is noting, one, the absolute important value of learning about their rights and how they can navigate those spaces, but also building friendships and feeling like they're a part of some larger initiative, some bigger calling to support the community at large. And then finally, Sada, a Syrian refugee girl, also shared how she developed friendships with her friends while attending trainings on political campaigns. It's really cool. I didn't know anyone before I moved to Chicago or moved here to Chicago. When I started attending the trainings, I met my best friends. We're all like interested in social issues. We're like very close and we're making a difference. It's very cool. So just to reiterate, building friendships, and also they all get to kind of connect on important issues that mean something to them and that are really important to their identities. And I'll just forge ahead for the last one, just for the sake of time. The final reason was to stay informed and to advocate for their families. And so Abia, a Syrian refugee student, stated, I try to help my family understand what's going on. I try to help my community. I mean, I'm still learning about the United States, but it's important to speak. They say mean things about me being Muslim. I try to say something or write to government people with my issues too. We learned how to write letters to government people in the academy. We learned to speak up when people say bad things about us. And so this was a common thread as well. It was important for them to stay, for her and for other young people to stay informed. Once again, to put
there's a red manumission conduct behind a over the top right corner.
what's going on. Okay.
I have no idea what that's from.
Okay.
I just found
Okay.
something I needed. Okay, sorry for the interruption.
Oh yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine. And so and we'll kind of talk about this shortly, but I mean, how powerful that these young people are writing their government officials. We have adults who don't do that. I'm sure droves of people who never do that, right? So these trainings in and of itself, they're quite powerful and really inspiring and informing the young people on how they can speak up and speak out against injustice. And then the other quote from Khalida, an Iraqi refugee, shared, I like attending the meetings on letter writing and protest. I didn't know you could do that here in the United States. I didn't know people actually cared about what I had to say. They, American citizens, needed to know that we refugees matter in this country. And so I recall the interview was quite powerful. They all were. But the young person saying, like, we're not invisible, right? Like we are here, but also being in shock that, and even though I can critique, U.S. policies and our the policies as well as our process around democracy and how people can kind of show up and to advocate for themselves. She mentioned in her country that just wasn't a process. There wasn't even a feasible way that they could engage the government. In fact, if they pushed back or even wrote a letter or even uttered a negative word about the government, bad things could happen. That's what she would always say, bad things could happen. Bad things could happen to my family if we spoke negatively about the government at all. And so I think she was in shock that, one, that there was a level of civic action that she could engage in while she was here, and push back on some of the negative treatment of others. And so if we circle back to the framework, the 3 C's, right? The first one was focused on the reflection piece, right? And so the young people, and this is typically considered to be a precursor to critical action. So young people do not blindly act to change oppressive social conditions without some awareness that their social conditions are unjust. And so definitely it's commendable that a lot of the organizations were even informing or giving young people a space to kind of process some of the things they're observing or hearing that really are oppressive. And so the refugee youth, they had a space to actually articulate some of their frustration with the negative and often xenophobic images of refugees, which are heavily influenced by media and also influenced by the overall political climate. And so the reason why I started off framing that these interviews, they were conducted during the Trump administration, is because there was quite a bit of negative rhetoric and xenophobia that was quite rampant, right? In media and young people, they were absolutely exposed to that. And so they had a space where they could process that a bit more. And from that, they were able to reflect a bit more on what that meant to them and their identities and who they are. They were becoming increasingly aware of the policies that were being enacted, also against refugee and migrant groups, which led them to want to do something. They wanted to act. And so just thinking back to that administration, there were a lot more policies that were against Muslims or people who were born in Muslim majority countries. And so I remember the young people stating that maybe I'm not being impacted, but I have family members who are from these countries or people who are not refugees. And so it still feels like it's an attack on me. Moreover, they gained a greater knowledge of the extent of unequal and fair treatment of refugee and migrant groups. And so all of that combined, and then once again, the workshops and classes and volunteer experiences, it truly gave them a chance to learn more about inequality and oppression, but to think through, what does this mean? How can we forge ahead? And so the next part is the motivation. And I think that was pretty apparent in some of the quotes. They were motivated to help their families. They wanted to push back on this idea that they were bad citizens, or that they actually were negative parts of the society. They didn't bring any value to the society. So there were a slew of reasons why the young people were motivated to create change. And so, but it's one thing to kind of think in your head, this is bad, but it's another thing to forge ahead and to figure out how that translates to create change individually as well as collectively. And so the refugee students displayed a high level of motivation or agency to be active in their communities by engaging in purposeful activities after tapping into the collective power of their various communities with similar identities. And so I think one of the two quotes, it kind of named that, in addition to building relationships with their peers and feeling connected to others, they were mobilizing amongst themselves. They were creating a bigger voice. And that, as many of you know, is really how movements start, right? If it's just one person, you can certainly create change, but this collective power was really important in allowing them, or for them to feel emboldened to create change in their communities. And then some of the young people, they were more likely to achieve, and this is just research, right? So young people who are actively engaged in their communities, research shows that they typically have better health and educational outcomes. They also have, they actually tend to build more trust with adults. They tend to be more engaged in their community, and being civically engaged is absolutely a part of that, a part of young people being able to have better health and educational outcomes. And so this is research that is very much so an anchor for this work, and this study supports that, right? So the young people, they were broadening their overall social capital by connecting with their peers. They were, and once again, I don't have time to kind of delve into this a bit more, but many of them did have better educational outcomes. They actually were performing better in school. So it kind of helped to inform and guide some of the other areas of their lives. Many of the young people said, I feel like I have a purpose, or that I'm able to do more. And some of this work was informed that. And then finally, critical action, or behaviors that challenge inequalities and oppressive systems, was originally described as societal involvement, to encompass many different ways that youth participate in civic action. And so research shows this is absolutely important. It really does help young people to develop not only their sense of self-worth, but also that they have agency and power, and that they can execute or engage in that. And so several of the young people, they named that they were engaging in letter writing campaigns to politicians, which I've already noted. It was a group of them that were engaging in this work. Others were they were engaging in voter registration and attending education workshops, such as Know Your Rights training. Many of them talked about civil rights, and like, I have rights, and yes, I'm under 18, but when I get to vote, I'll be able to do these things, but not waiting until they turned 18 or feeling like that was the only way they could engage in their communities. finally really advocating and pushing for their families to be civically engaged. So many of the young people stated, my parents, they don't know much about this topic. They're not, perhaps the English is not as good yet, and they're still developing in that area, or perhaps they're busy with work or with other very important activities in the family. And so it really is up to me to kind of inform them. And then refugee youth express a desire to engage in civic duties in after-school programs as a mechanism to connect with their peers and community members who share similar identities. And so it really did help to broaden their networks in important ways. And so, what does this mean? So community education workshops are absolutely critical and helpful to introduce refugee youth and their families to important concepts and themes related to civic engagement. Frankly, I would say this is important for everybody. So once again, I would have benefited from something like this. I didn't really learn some of these rules until I was in college. But I think it's absolutely critical for the refugee and immigrant youth to understand what supports what rights they have. They are in a precarious state, right? And there is, unfortunately, we don't live in a country where everyone is supportive of refugee and migrants being here. And so I think they want to know how they can navigate those spaces and push back on policies and programs that perhaps can harm them. And so knowing your right campaigns and workshops are absolutely important. I would even argue in an ideal world, this would be infused into schools, right? So these were out-of-school programs. As you can imagine, people are self-selecting to be involved in this, and so I would argue some young people would probably be interested in these types of topics and workshops if they were perhaps universally implemented in schools so that they could engage in this work. And research, like I said, it supports that involvement in civic activities and being aware of your rights is really, it's really helpful, not only for your sense of self-worth and your development, but also your health, like your health and your educational outcomes. So what future research may come of this? Unpacking the barriers facing refugee youth, engaging in civic activities, and possibly also thinking through how it could lead to careers. As I mentioned, many of the youth, they were engaging in leadership programs, know your rights trainings. They were educating themselves and others on these important policies and rules. And so how could that be translated into careers and into possibilities, right? This is the community we're at, right? What does that mean? Because it's very powerful. And then also, while this study highlighted political engagement among refugee youth, it's not a universal practice. And so it would be worthwhile to understand maybe what prompted some youth to be engaged in this type of work and others maybe aren't. Informally, this is not in the paper I wrote, but some of the youth had siblings who were nervous about being civically engaged, that perhaps it would hinder them from becoming a citizen in the US, or perhaps that it would follow them, right? That they might get deported. Even though for refugees, you're not going to get deported, many of them still felt a level of fear. And so it would be interesting to kind of unpack what prompted some of the young people to be involved, whereas others were a little bit more apprehensive or nervous about any pushback against the political government or regime. And then in conclusion, just to kind of recap on some of the major themes, once again, this study highlights refugee youth increased engagement in civically driven OST programs, once again, igniting their overall critical consciousness. So this is really thinking through how does, it's one thing to observe, to see that there is inequality in the world, but for some of these young people, it didn't stop there. They were motivated by this. They were motivated by, unfortunately, some negative experiences and rhetoric that was being shared with them through media or through their neighborhoods and communities, and it led to some action. And then obviously having adults in the picture to really to guide that process was critical. And so that just kind of rehashes that. And this framework is valuable in determining how OST can function as a mechanism or ideal environment for offering refugee youth these opportunities. So like I say, in a perfect idealistic world, I think schools, this would be a requirement. But in the meantime, since I know schools already have so much to contend with and so many topics and curriculum that they have to, you know, to share with the young people. I definitely think having more opportunities in after school spaces would be a great space. And then connection to the Global Possibility Network. What does this have to do with anything? I feel like people have probably made some connections, but I'll just spell it out for you. This study connects to the possibility development framework by considering how refugee students' participation in civic activities demonstrates their capacity to conceive of a more equitable and just future and world. There is a level of hope. And if anything, leave with that in mind, right? There's hope. Young people feel like they are central to that, right? So they're not just bystanders who are thinking, I hope the world becomes a better place, but that I'm going to be a part of that, that there's better possibilities, there's better ways that things can be done, and they are a part of that. And also drawing on the interest in the political activities and engagement. And I think I noted this before, it's like, what does that mean? What possibilities or potential careers and their leadership opportunities can that lead them to, which I think is absolutely powerful. Like these young people, I would love to see them run for office or to continue to kind of inform and to educate themselves and to become leaders in their fields. All right, and this study was funded by the Fosbeck Fund. Thank you. They got me through my dissertation, and I am done. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions and a robust conversation.
Oh, this was so awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Cureton, for this.
Thank you.
So if we have about 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has a question, I'm happy to start. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Feel free to start, Jackie.
So then I will start. So something that really stood out to me, particularly from my counseling background and working in schools, is the importance of critical self-reflection, but our schools don't often provide the time, the space, or even our educators don't have the tools to facilitate that critical self-reflection. So for example, one of the students was like, I didn't know I had rights, but facilitating somebody making meaning of what they do with this realization is something that we often don't provide opportunities for. So my question is, what would increased critical reflection look like in our schools? Where can this gap be filled? So many follow-ups though, but
no, that's a good question, and it made me think. I think it depends on where you are in the country, like where you're situated. I mean, let's be very transparent. I think like CRT, for example, a critical race theory and other themes around like social justice or social inequality or oppression is shunned in many of our schools. My sister is a superintendent in Texas, and I mean, that's a no-no. Like there's just certain topics you can't bring up. And so I imagine, depending on where you are situated or where, educators are situated in the country, even language around rights and like knowing your rights and it would probably be shunned or dismissed or that it would be silenced. And so I would like to think that there would probably need to be a shift in or at least more school districts would have to be receptive to that type of language. But that means we would also have to be critical of some of the injustices and atrocities that have been directed towards migrant and refugee groups, indigenous groups, Blacks, right? So I think there would have to be an openness to have very difficult conversations as to why do young people need to know their rights in the first place? Well, it's because there's oppression, like they're being oppressed, that there's rampant inequality. And I'm not sure if a lot of school districts are willing to have that. But let's just say there is a school district, because there are some that are more liberal, they're more open to having those type of conversations. I do think it would have to be kind of a top-down approach. And I think the administration and teachers and social workers and counselors, all of them would have to receive training and some insight on how do you have difficult conversations around some of these themes and understanding the historical shifts and reasons for these conversations. And so and then also having mental health support. And of course, I'm going to say that I'm a social worker by training. You're a counselor, right? A lot of these themes, it really it can impact over young people's mental health, their well-being, and so not having the appropriate people at the schools to help to mitigate that or to address that would be, to me, extremely detrimental. So even when I have these conversations at the university level, right? Some of the conversations I know will be triggering, and so anticipating that that might happen, making sure I offer those type of supports. But there's a reason why people need to know their rights. It's because they're being infringed upon. They're being yeah, they're not being they're not able to kind of hold that, or there's a lack of agency or support that they're not receiving. And so so in the meantime, I do think out of school programs would be helpful. Also, a lot, at least with the refugees, typically those organizations hosting it, they were organizations that the young people and their families were familiar with. They felt safe. And so they were able to have really in-depth and meaningful conversations around it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about the rights. Some refugees, so for example, if they commit a crime and they get convicted, they serve some time in prison and they get deported. Some of them grew up in Rwanda, like a neighboring country, and all they know is life in Rwanda before the US. But when they get deported because they were born in Congo, they get sent back to Congo. They get dropped off in the city, and that's it. And that's really scary. And I was wondering how are the rights, if you have a crime, is it the same thing, or is there a yeah.
So, just so I'm clear, so if it's someone who is a refugee who's resettled here and they commit a crime, what happens? Okay. So that is an excellent question. My students ask, I get this question a lot from my students. So in the extreme cases, and I want to say it's extreme because most refugees who come here, they don't commit crimes. In fact, even to get here in the US, the level of vetting is extreme, especially if you're from certain regions of the world. So when I had refugees from Syria and Iraq or Afghanistan, the amount of vetting that they have to go through even to get here is personally, I think it's kind of violating their human rights, but that's a different conversation. But it's intense, it's rigorous, and it's intense. So I just want to just name that first. It's very rare for refugees or migrants to commit crimes. It's mostly US born people who are committing the crimes in the terrorist act. So but I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. So you probably are in agreement. In rare cases where a refugee would commit a crime, like a heinous crime, right? Could they be deported? Yes. Could there be a case where they would be deported? Yes. But it's rare. It's rare that happens. I feel like a few years ago, there may have been a shooting, and it perhaps was a migrant or a refugee, and I think they were deported, but it's very rare that it even happens. But yes, could it happen? Yes. There would still be a level of, and if they had a good lawyer, they could push back and say, well, according to the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention, you can't send people back. So there's a clause in there that says you can't send someone back, especially to their country of origin, if it's unsafe, right? There's a civil war in Syria. I can't send people back. And that's what the convention it's supposed to protect refugees. So a lawyer could push back and say, well, yes, this person should be imprisoned because they committed a crime, but they technically should not be sent back to their country of origin or whatever, wherever that is, especially if there's ongoing strife because of this policy in the 1951 Refugee Convention. But that's all legal stuff. In another life, I wanted to be a refugee lawyer. And so I get excited about it, but that's beyond my jurisdiction. But that could be an argument.
Yeah. Because I feel there is some of them who even get a misdemeanor, and they're always scared when they apply for citizenship if they're gonna get it, or if they're gonna get another green card.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Right.
think
But what I will say, I mean, no matter what your role is, and I spend a lot of time with my students going over, what's the difference between a parolee, which, just so you know, the folks from Afghanistan and Ukraine, they're actually not refugees, they're actually parolees, which means that there's a temporary time that they can stay in the US. It's usually 2 years and then it has to be like renewed. So anyway, but there's all these distinctions, right? So an immigrant versus a migrant and a refugee, or someone who's undocumented. But one thing I will say is, no matter what your status is, whether you're here for a green card, you're in a precarious state, right? So anything can really, it can trigger someone to be deported, especially if you commit crimes. So that's why I can't give a blanket answer, but you really have to be like, even like a traffic stop, right? I mean, something drastic like that could really cause someone to be deported. And so you are, no matter, what your status is, living in a pretty precarious state, which can be, and think about young people, right? If their parents can be deported, or even if it's the notion that it's a possibility, that's going to impact their identity, their mental health, how they function in schools, all of that. It's all intertwined. And so it can be really tough for young people to navigate spaces where they don't feel like they're wanted, and that any type of crime or anything that's committed by them or someone in their network, it could be pretty detrimental.
Quick question. I want to jump in. So thank you. Loved it. And I just really appreciate how you cover so much ground here. I mean, you talked about some theory, you talked about some methods, and then there's just a lot going on in terms of your findings and the content. And I think that youth civic engagement is, I mean, that's a topic that is extremely broad and applicable to every kid. And I have a couple of comments and questions, and I'll keep it brief. But so one of your earlier slides, I had this question of what's the relationship between critical motivation and this kind of classic psychological idea of the locus of control. I'm not a psychologist, I'm an anthropologist, but this idea of the locus of control is, it can almost be a sociological term too, where you're thinking about your own agency, your own ability to get stuff done on a kind of personal level. So that relationship between critical motivation and locus of control, I'm really interested in that. And then another idea I think that you touched upon in your commentary, which seemed really interesting to me, was when you were following up to Jackie's question. So I'm a school board member in a suburban district, mostly white, but our demographics in terms of white and non-white is like 70-30. And there has been some dialogue in our community over the past few years, 4 or 5 years, about what we can do to create more representation in our teaching and our administrative ranks. And so initiatives that are, as you said, top down, we have adopted an initiative that's been, I think, pretty helpful and pretty, I think, significant in that it's something. But there are some of us that believe that we need to keep pushing it further, that even though the initiative focuses on belonging, that maybe we need to ramp it up a little bit and talk a little bit more about specific kinds of discrimination and representation, to kind of sharpen the conversation a little bit. And one more comment on that is that I think you're right, actually, that in suburban districts, which are mostly white, I'm inserting that, by the way, but that there is a kind of resistance to sharpening the conversation, getting a little more traction, and to be continued. But I know I covered a lot there. Let me just recap. So first thing is relationship between critical motivation and locus of control. I was really interested in that. And then this other idea about improving, how do we improve these top-down efforts that local leaders can really kind of take the baton and really run with this and show the way on it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate that. And I've heard of the term locus of control. I feel like in one of my psych classes that absolutely was an anchor to some of our discussions. I'm less familiar with it, but based on what you've shared, I mean, I definitely think there's a relationship between the two. And so I'm going to look it up afterwards. I mean, I think that motivation piece is just so critical. And I think that informs whether someone feels a level of agency that they like, but what I think what I'm curious about, and perhaps this gets to your point, is like what prompts that? Like, I mean, simply having a motivation doesn't necessarily always translate to action, or if people feel like they can,
Yep.
or who gives them permission
Right.
to actually like to activate it. That was the word I was like how to activate it. And that's something, you know, even with the young people, I think I was interested in learning like what activated that. And wanting to explore that more, right? Like while some people, a lot of the young people were exposed to or had conversations about the inequality and oppression that they were experiencing as well as what they were observing, but it didn't always activate or push them to do anything about it. And that's the same with a lot of us, right? Like we watch the news and see things all the time, and it doesn't necessarily translate into action. And that's something it's just a good point.
Yeah, it's just something worth kind of exploring, because I think that part of what possibility development theory tries to get at is a little bit. I think Jackie just threw it in the chat. Wow, it's like volley and serve right there. Yes. You know, translating that insight into action. I mean, this is something that is just part of being a human animal, right? I mean, this is a very, very basic thing, right? And so I think it's fascinating. So critical motivation, when you brought it up, it struck me as a part of that conversation. Real quick, this is about locus of control. It's this idea. I think Albert Bandura came up with it, but it's the idea that, you know, where's the center of your control or your agency over your own life? Is it outside you or is it within you? And it's linked to this idea of learned helplessness, which I think Bandura also was part of that discussion. Any psychologist, please jump in and disabuse me of my my hack job here. But the general idea is, you know, how do we create more of a sense of agency for young people? And if you have these young people that feel agency and they're doing something with it, and they are writing letters, they are maybe attending some protests, they are maybe doing boycotts of some kind of civic action, maybe they're engaged, they're doing things. I mean, that's wonderful. And then you ask them, how did you get that feeling? Is this a personal thing? Was there something sort of structured or systematic that helped you? Some kind of support that helped you? Again, not a psychologist, but you know, there's good research to show that support is really helpful. That if a person feels supported, that will help their motivation.
Yeah. Okay, that was helpful. Yeah, no, that context was very helpful. So the only thing I would add, and I know time is of the essence, is I think another layer to this is really exploring like the adults, the people who are creating these opportunities for the young people, which this study didn't. Once again, that wasn't the focus. But honestly, when I was talking to the young people, I was intrigued by the adults really exposing them and giving them space to really process, and then giving them even the insight or the tools or language to kind of consider actions, or like engagement in their communities. And so I don't know if that would be a part of like the locus control, is like really unpacking the supports, right? The adults, the community partners who are creating spaces for the young people to even have that is in my opinion unique, right? Like I said, I didn't have that when I was a young person.
Sure.
I'm seeing some folks like, yeah, that would have been cool for me to do that too, right? That's not a common universal experience for even US born youth. And so I thought that it is definitely a powerful lens to kind of think about as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
If we could just one more question that was in the chat, just to have time for a few more minutes, but do you suggest any theoretical implications of your findings?
Well, I definitely leaned on Paulo Freire's framework. So, I mean, one could argue that could be enhanced to kind of think through even the conversation we're having, right? Like, I don't think these three distinct buckets or themes or dimensions are linear. I think they can all happen simultaneously, but really unpacking a little bit more around this motivation piece, and what other factors contribute to that. So in addition to them being motivated by personal experiences or observations, is there anything else that really informs that? I think that would absolutely maybe enhance or broaden that framework a lot more. I imagine the locus of control. Andrew, I feel like I'm going to look this up. I'm like, I got to know more. I have to know more, right? I imagine that, is that like a theoretical, is a theory or more of a framework?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a term of art that I think Albert Bandura came up with.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just going to use my limited time here. I'm just going to try to find a quick citation of it, just while we're talking about it,
Yeah, and I do think that it's not a theoretical, it's not a theory per se, but I do always think of this notion of resilience and how that is absolutely embedded in the work we're doing. And some of these young people, they like I said, they have to contend with quite a bit. So the fact that they're willing to take on this extra, uh, one can say labor, right, or engagement in a community on top of all the other demands of being a young person and then learning a new culture, it really does kind of reflect an added layer of resilience, um, but also ownership and kind of ownership of their own experiences. And so, once again, not a theory per se, but definitely kind of broadening um, how we view resiliency, but also taking ownership um, of their own lives. And yeah, it kind of makes me think of that as well. Those are some of my initial thoughts. I don't know if there are other theories that perhaps would be
Okay.
helpful.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, okay, I'm unmuted. So I just did a quick thing about it. So Bandura actually got the idea. So Bandura was really interested in self-efficacy, and
Hmm.
um, so he was a big theorist on that. And actually, he brought in his conversations about, um, and this is just kind of again non-specialist understanding of things, but apparently there's an American psychologist named Julian Rotter, and in 1954 he came up with the term locus of control. So I think it was popularized in Bandura's writings about self-efficacy.
Okay.
That's a little intellectual history there, which
Yeah.
I
And that absolutely aligns with the framework because there's the level of political
yes,
efficacy, right? And so that was absolutely, so yeah, they definitely overlap. And also, I kind of tucked it in there because I have a background in sociology, but this whole notion of social capital as well. So that was absolutely an important part, especially like building community and network. Well, through that, not only were they, engaging with people on how to be civically engaged, but they were just broadening their network in general and
yes,
learning and more from the community and accessing more adults in their lives. And so that absolutely, I mean, that theory and framework can absolutely be enhanced as well as thinking through what are other spaces, other avenues in which refugee youth build
yeah. That's a great.
social capital.
To me, that's a great question. I don't know. It's not my field or anything, but it's very interesting to me. It seems that these kids are building social capital by building their networks with their peers, but crucially from the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this is something that it really disturbs me to hear about kids talking about racism and discrimination. It really pisses me off because I mean, it's a we're a quick sidestep into talking about the United States as a settler colony and all of that, right? So, what is the significance of a moral significance of a refugee in the context of that recognition, right? That's another. But so, but oftentimes, just the facts are that oftentimes refugees, people don't make a distinction. People that are discriminatory don't make a distinction between refugees and people who are immigrants in other veins or under other kind of capacities, right? And so oftentimes refugees they're people that are highly educated, they're professionals, so in other words, the social capital that refugee adults have to offer the refugee youth in a kind of community seems to be a really interesting kind of area of it's really piqued my curiosity here. In other words, the social capital, meaning the networks and the knowledge that those adults have that they can pass on to their youth, right?
Right.
Yeah. And even civic cultural capital and the relationship between cultural capital and civic engagement. It's one thing to know you have rights, but another thing to know how to move in a system that is upholding or disenfranchising rights. So, oh, this was so fun.
Hey, yeah, nice dialogue. I like it. Thank you. I was